To time that Jersey.
Not already. Okay, good afternoon. My name is Angel Nieves, and I'm Director of Northeastern's Humanities Center, and Dean's Professor of Public and Digital Humanities. I want to welcome you to the first of our Faculty Works in Progress series talks for the fall. I'm especially excited about this year's lineup because it provides us with an opportunity to continue to expand the work of the Humanities Center to include more works that address our growing interests and focus on the role of the public humanities in the 21st century research university. I want to thank our in-person and online attendees, especially at the start of an incredibly busy semester already. I'm extremely excited to have a longtime collaborator and partner. I often call her my partner in crime, Dr. Dorothy Kim, who teaches in the English and Women's Gender Sexuality Studies Department at Brandeis University. Her research focuses on race, gender, digital humanities, medieval women's literary cultures and medievalism, Jewish Christian difference, book history, digital media, and the alt-right. Her book, Jewish Christian Entanglements, and Krenawissa and its Material Worlds, is set to be published with the University of Pennsylvania Press. She has received fellowships from Shirk, Ford Foundation, Fulbright, Mellon, and the AAUW. She also has an edited volume in the Cultural History of Race series with Kim Coles. She is the associate editor for the Journal of Early Middle English and the co-editor for the Medieval to Early Modern section of Literature Compass. She recently was the Medieval Academy of America Best Article Prize winner in Critical Race Studies for Politics of the Medieval Pre-Racial. She has also been awarded the Society for Medieval Feminist Scholarship 2021 Best Article Prize with Gabby Byczowski for Visions of Medieval Transfeminism. She was the project co-director in the NEH-funded Scholarly Editions and Translations Project at the Archive of Early Middle English, and she's now taken over that project for its next phase at Brandeis. She's also a project co-director for the Global Middle Ages Project and is co-writing a book with Lynn Ramey on medieval global digital humanities for Cambridge University Press. She's also written two edited volumes in the digital humanities, and one, The Alternative Histories of the Digital Humanities, won the American Studies Association Garfinkel D.H. Caucus Prize. She is incredibly prolific in her work, in her writing, and in her public online presence. She is part of a collaboration here with CSSH, the Library, and the Humanities Center on the Reckonings Project as the co-director of our Summer Institute, where community partners, faculty, and students consider the best practices for community-based DH projects in the local Boston and New England areas. I want to thank her for taking time out of her schedule to come and speak with us, and I'm so looking forward to this talk. Thank you.
So thanks for that lovely introduction, and I just want to make sure that you can hear me. Yes, okay. So my talk today is called, oh.
Camera's not talking, you can. Should we move the podium?
All right.
Move?
Yes. Yes.
Oh, it moves. It does.
We can have water. I'll just get that.
Must respond to the needs of our class.
Yeah.
Come back.
Both the cameras.
All right. All right, here we go. Okay, so the title of my talk is Medieval Black London, Bioarchaeology, Black Feminist Methodology, and the Whitewashing of History. This project began when a senior medievalist of color sent me a newly published article in Medieval Bioarchaeology because it had mentioned me. This article, this was in 2019.
I'm so sorry.
It's okay. This article, officially absent but actually present, bioarchaeological evidence for Population Diversity in London During the Black Death, AD 1348 to 50, by Rebecca Redfern at the Center for Human Bioarchaeology at the Museum of London, and Joseph T. Hefner in Anthropology at Michigan State University, was published in late spring 2019. Discuss the analysis of one gravesite in London to consider a wider population diversity in the city just at the moment of the second plague pandemic, often referred to as the Black Death, and I'm going to refer to here as SPP. It had a small sample from an East Smithfield gravesite and projected the potential population from this data of 29% that was not white European, the majority of which was identified as Black African. After I read this piece, I invited them to write the Race and Science chapter in the Cultural History of Race, 1350-1550. After that draft was turned in, they actually invited me to collaborate with them on a piece that expanded on their original article. So about 3 years ago, I began a collaboration with Rebecca Redfern, Joe Hefner, and also Sharon DeWitt at the University of Colorado. This group of bioanthropologists and bioarchaeologists to consider race, pandemic disease in relationship to the medieval second plague pandemic, as we said, often described as the Black Death, and the medieval 14th century London population. This collaborative article will be coming out in Bioarchaeology International entitled Race, Population, Affinity, and Mortality Risk During the Second Plague Pandemic in 14th Century London, England. For the rest of this presentation, I will be taking directly from that article to lay out some of the argument and the evidence before I finish with takeaways. I'm happy to answer questions that I can during Q&A. Please don't ask me specific technical things, because that is actually something I would ask one of the other three. Depending on who's doing what. So the second plague pandemic, SPP's first outbreak in the mid-14th century, many millions of people across Eurasia and Africa, and was one of the most catastrophic disease events the world has ever experienced. The SPP continued in the form of outbreaks and isolated cases of plague for centuries afterwards, led to increased tension between different communities, status groups, and religions, though these detrimental divisions and structural inequalities already existed and had been rising for many years, in part due to the Little Ice Ages, and this is 1300 to 1870 AD, successive waves of famine and climatic instability. Despite some medieval primary source suggesting that the first wave of SPP killed almost everyone it infected, bioarchaeological research has provided evidence that, at least in some contexts, it was not an indiscriminate killer. For example, in London, individuals with evidence of physiological stressors experienced prior to the epidemic, including those associated with a developmental disruption during childhood, were more likely to die during the 1348 to 1315 AD outbreak compared to age peers without evidence of such previous exposure to stress. The SPP documentary evidence reveals gender and class categories and basically versions of structural inequality, compounded harm and population. But there is thus existing evidence that medieval plague mortality risk varied along both biopolitical and sociocultural dimensions. However, to date, no bioarchaeological research has addressed the potential effects of structural racism, despite primary source evidence showing that Northern Europe had a diverse and racialized population during this period. To further clarify the ways in which biosocial factors affected risks of mortality during the SPP, our study is the first to combine osteological evidence for population affiliation with skeletal data on sex, age of death, and physiological stress in human remains excavated from a London 14th century SPP burial ground. We test the hypothesis that people who would have been identified as belonging to population affiliations other than white European and specifically connected to an African geographical affiliation and who are therefore potentially racialized as Black in life or suffered the stressors associated with anti-Blackness, migration, forced or otherwise, and unfreedoms at demise or over a lifetime, face higher risk of death compared to white Europeans during the SPP. This is a pre-modern example of current discussions concerning race and COVID-19. Our paper focuses on anti-Black structural racism within Christian cemeteries, racial capitalism's earlier genealogies, and medieval London as a location to highlight how a substantial community can be erased from history. Before the plague reached England in 1348 AD, extensive preparation had been made to cope with the epidemic. This included the creation of two emergency burial grounds, East Smithfield, close to the Tower of London, and West battlefield positioned further north in the city. The plague reached London in fall of 1348, resulting in 60% of the city's population dying until it waned in 1351. Sloan has shown that the city's parish cemeteries, numbering over 100, buried the majority of the plague victims. However, these cemeteries mostly have not been divided into pre- and post-plague phases, meaning that the emergency burial ground populations remain unique. Black feminist praxis and recent anti-racist work that utilizes historical context to analyze a site informs our research, as Cho and colleagues advocate use the term population infinity and mixed race, mindful that racism is a social reality that can affect biology. So in this section, we contextualize the distinct specificities of time, geography, conditions in relationship to medieval England and race that is different from other European geographies. Despite scholars documenting the multiracial scene in early modern England, the image, and this includes Habib, Imtaz Habib, Dorothy Kim, or more recently, an earlier modern English ship, this is Mary Rose. The image of a white medieval English England persists. This white nostalgia is rooted in the same white supremacist ideology that has fed contemporary violence. Likewise, medieval studies scholarship has boosted this pre-racial version of the pre-modern path that has allowed medieval cultures, societies, writers, and power brokers to hide behind white innocence, when the truth is that race, structural racism, was probably invented, refined, and rehearsed in medieval England, medieval Europe in general, but definitely medieval England. Geraldine Hang explains that medieval race is, quote, a structural relationship for the articulation and management of human differences rather than of substantive content, with religion the paramount source of authority in the medieval period. For instance, the subject attested people to a political theology that could biologize, define, and essentialize an entire community as fundamentally and absolutely different, unquote. Our definition of race centers the Black feminist material term, biopolitical and sociocultural, dependent on location and temporality. But many historians have argued that using race to describe the medieval phenomenon of structural racism is anachronistic. Others in pre-modern critical race studies, as well as critical race theorists, have in the last several decades made it emphatically clear that the term to use is race rather than anything else. Later medieval England, circa 1100 to 1500, inherited through its written and spoken cultures narratives of a racialized hierarchy connected to geographic space and climate, ideas that can be traced back to Hippocrates. The Hippocratic work was not in circulation in the Middle Ages. Its vision of a geographic climatological organization of racial hierarchy is present in cartography. For example, in the Hereford World Map and this is the Salter map, which centers and gives more room to European places and territories. Medieval English white Christianity based its racialization on population affinity connected to organizing people by climatological, geographical, racial difference, meaning that medieval English anti-Blackness included epidermal racialization. England had already begun practicing how to organize, categorize, hierarchize non-hegemonic white Christian groups because it was an early racial state. The English state, as part of a larger colonial project in the 12th and 13th century, also racialized the Welsh, Irish, and Muslims in its Eastern Mediterranean Crusader colony, the last of which they lost in 1291, using many of the same Orientalist tropes flung at both real and imagined Islamic foes. Structural racism had different terrain and archives for different groups. In the case of the English, ratio, religious, Jewish, and Islamic difference, we can identify their population by how they were buried in grave sites. And for the pre-1290 Jewish community in England, a small Anglo-Hebrew documentary archive exists. For the Welsh and Irish who the English colonized in the 12th and 13th centuries, we have substantial documentary archives of how the subaltern racialized population spoke back to English colonial hegemony. In contrast, the medieval Black English population did not have emic documentation or viewpoint from which we hear directly about their lives or racial formation, or else the documentation has been completely whitewashed because the white imaginary defined medieval England as a white population space. Concomitantly, hundreds of archives were destroyed during the dissolution. So this is 1536 to 40, this is Henry VIII. And medieval scholarship has deliberately whitewashed the presence of Black people in archives. We have two examples, one methodological and one documentary from the medieval English, the documentary one from the medieval English literary canon that demonstrates the consequence for the documentary and archaeological record. So first, across Britain and Europe, the majority of osteoarchaeological professional recording standards do not record population affinity or ancestry due to a combination of factors. It only being introduced in British standards created in 2004 and in 2017. Not all bioarchaeology, human osteology, paleopathology courses are teaching these methods, and many archaeological contractors have not revised their standards for over a decade. Consequently, the white imaginary that assumes a de facto white population is used as the empirical evidence for the population discussion of all medieval European human remains, and especially burial grounds. Therefore, the paucity of population affiliation data means that no empirical evidence for a white-only population in medieval England actually exists. Instead, immense work must be done to debunk the white supremacist scholarly and methodological structures that have upheld and kept the white racial imaginary in place for centuries and is central to the white medieval heritage politics and contemporary far-right politics. Feel free to tell or to ask me about the anecdote discussion about this in Q&A, but basically the takeaway is that except for my collaborating colleagues, no bioarchaeologists, bioanthropologists working on medieval Europe between 500 to 1500 uses race as a category of analysis. This has affected our analysis of the English documentary record. It is also a record in white scholarly methodologies. Ontologies and whitewashing. The white imaginary has trained scholars to skip over what is plain to see, or told some of us who were sort of wondering, no, that is not what you see. My documentary example is from Chaucer, and particularly the Huntington Library manuscript of the Ellesmere Chaucer. The work of 14th century London poet Geoffrey Chaucer has been the subject of scholarship for centuries, and his Canterbury Tales has been a British school colonial text, as we know from Gowrie Viswanathan's work. Yet only recently has race been discussed with respect to the Cook's Tale. This tale, which describes an apprentice cook named Perkin Revelers, London life, involves gambling, sex workers, and occasional prison stints. Perkin Reveler is physically described as, and I'm just going to do the translation, quote, brown as a berry, a proper short fellow with black locks combed elegantly, unquote. This is folio 46 verso. And 47 verso. Jonathan Shue is the first to discuss Reveler in relationship to race, quote, a racialized brownness, using the potential of racial speculation. The white gaze is so embedded that scholars see the darker skin color in the Ellesmere manuscript's cook portrait as evidence of disease or low social class. There are over 36 medieval English documents that attest to the black cook. This is an example of a specific documentary archive in which all scholarship has skipped over the cook as a black servant in 14th century London. Early Chaucer and race scholars had to temper their arguments because the empirical population evidence upheld the white racial imaginary of a white medieval England. And then both my colleague Jonathan Shue and Corey recording population affiliation would have a cascading and seismic effect in scholarship, prompting a reassessment of medieval European primary sources. Osteological data will allow medieval scholars to say that these Black men, women, and children who've been recorded are not a fantasy or just possibilities. Such data also would reveal an earlier start to England's adoption and practice of racialized unfreedoms. Though medieval England's race technology was mutable, biopolitical, and sociocultural, English white Christian hegemony saw racial difference as immutable and in the blood. Anyone who was marked visually or embodies as originating outside of Europe, particularly if they fitted a Black Ethiopian description, would have been racialized. So the Royal Mint site, which is the Smithfield sites and the parish gravesite of St. Mary Graces, in relationship to the effect of pandemic disease and population affiliations, offers us an insight into medieval racial necropolitics and structural violence. The effects of structural racism can be found in archaeological data and health disparities observed in human remains. To do justice to the human remains in our study, we foreground the work of Black feminist archaeology, particularly Whitney Battle Baptiste's works that suggest this, quote, takes into account the disadvantage of how these aspects of identity, primarily race and gender, act as a double and with class a triple form of oppression, unquote. This is alongside the work of Patricia Hill Collins, Kimberly Crenshaw, and the Combahee River Collective about intersectionality. We follow Sadia Hartman's work on the archive of slavery and Catherine McKittrick's on Black geography to center Black feminist archive and data methodologies. Though much work done in Black feminist archaeology focuses on North American post-1492 sites, we apply these methods to London's 14th century cityscape. The Royal Mint site also reorients our understanding of the transatlantic chattel slavery's archives beginnings. Likewise, the discussion of structural racism and pandemic necropolitics remains an ongoing lens of analysis. We bring these multidisciplinary strands together in order to, in Battle Baptiste's words, create a purposely coarse and textured analytical frame. Our framework pulls from the Black feminist work in the humanities, social sciences, and sciences. We contextualize the Royal Mint site as part of the archive of slavery, as well as what Sylvia Winter and Catherine McKittrick theorize as demonic grounds, and see medieval London as a Black diaspora geography, quote. Demonic grounds are not simply identifying categories of difference, absence, and the place and voices of Black women and our Black feminism. They also outline the ways in which this place is an unfinished and therefore transformative geography story. Sadia Hartman remarks upon the act of chance or disaster that allowed us to even have a sentence, a phrase to mark Black women's presence in the archival records, when the standard encounter with the archive is silence, erasure, and invisibility. Given that a percentage of those killed by the London plague pandemic epidemics were enslaved or formerly enslaved people, our Black feminist archaeology must first address the archive of slavery. Our archive, their remains, are precisely what Hartman characterized as a, quote, death sentence, a tomb, a display of the violated body, an inventory of property. We are reckoning with the impossibility of discussing pre-modern Black lives in any way that is not about pain and death. There remains, quote, the violence that deposited these traces in the archive, unquote, are our evidence and data points. This is why we must think through Black feminist archaeology to consider other ways to tell these narratives. Catherine McKittrick addresses the archive of slavery, Black women as data by calling attention to, quote, the mathematics of unliving, unquote. What McKittrick underlines is that these bodies, our osteological data, becomes an object commodity in which there is no way to give life or to tell stories. If the source of Blackness is death and violence, they argue, the citation of Blackness, the scholarly stories we tell, calls for the repetition of death and violence. But differently, historically present anti-Black violence is repaired by reproducing knowledge about the Black subjects that renders them less human, unquote. This is a methodological knot we must unravel. Hartman argues for a methodological shift to address this issue, what they call critical tabulation. Their purpose here is not to give voice to the slave, but rather to imagine what can be verified, a realm of experience which is situated between two zones of death, social and corporeal. McKittrick argues that Black studies is a method to work successfully on demonic grounds, precisely, quote, because the mathematics of Blackness and white supremacy are seemingly knowable, because accountable and counted, and always laden with a chaotic uncertainty. Developing that concept, archaeologist Llewellyn proposes that, quote, demonic grounds then becomes spaces that literally create a new conceptualizations of being, a possessed form of being that cannot be knowable, yet act as a fruitful space for exploration and knowledge production, thereby representing human geography. Designated 14th century London as a demonic ground allows us to re-examine our data to address these different possibilities. The pandemic burial grounds are a form of Black spatial geography, and especially a matter of Black diaspora. As Rachel Watkins explains, the works of Black feminist biopolitics and race, quote, discuss racializing assemblages as key vehicles through which biocentricity is reinforced and involves sociopolitical processes that discipline humanity into categories, such as human, not quite human, and non-human. Our Our approach aligns with this critical race genealogy, the biopolitical that thinks through racialized assemblages. Lastly, Black feminist methodology asks that this work be a collaboration with the community of stakeholders. As a form of social justice and an extension of Black feminist autoethnography. Watkins builds on the three-pillar structure advocated by Blakely in 1981. One, that scientific investigation is not an objective or passive practice. Two, that decolonized study of human biology should readily contribute to broader interdisciplinary investigation of human conditions and disparity. And three, the explicit recognition of human responsibility in the production of scientific knowledge. We plan to bring these methods into our future work. There are no UK projects similar to Michael Blakely's work at the New York African Burial Ground, as medieval and later burial grounds were not separated by race, but rather by religious tradition, and archaeological contractors do not consistently report population affiliation data. We agree with Franklin and others, Black feminist archaeologists, that related communities must be collaborators and partners in archaeological practice. We intend to keep accountable to these larger methodological goals. We believe the recent work of Finding Ceremony is an excellent example of descendant community-centered work. The osteological biographies we have done of the plague site at the Royal Mint, which are comprised of both the East Smithfield site and also the St. Mary Graces site, are pandemic mortality data. We have also included a control group of graves that were not buried because of pandemic death from the mid-14th century from the St. Mary Graces site and also from St. Mary Spittal Cemetery. The St. Mary Spittal Cemetery was organized into 4 different groups, people buried in 1100 to 1200, 1200 to 1250, 1250 to 1400, and 1400 to 1540 to ensure as best as possible that our analyses compared hazard rates for population affiliations during the second plague pandemic relative to non-plague mortality. We did not include individuals buried at the St. Mary's Spittal between 1250 and 1400. So these are our results. Analysis of adults from the population affiliation groups did not reveal any significant difference among the groups with respect to sex ratios for either the plague or non-plague samples. Using data from all 3 population affiliation groups, there are significantly higher proportions of people of estimated African and Asian affiliation in the plague burials compared to the non-plague burials, as shown in Table 3. Similarly, when using data from the pooled white European, Asian versus African population affiliation groups, there's a significant higher proportion of people of estimated African affiliation in the plague burials compared to the non-plague burials. This is 18.4% versus 8.3%. The mean ages at death and the corresponding 95% confidence intervals for each group among the plague burials are shown in Table 4. The results in Cox proportional hazards analysis of all 3 population affiliation groups and the pooled European, Asian versus African population affiliation groups are shown in Table 5. These results indicate that for the female-only sample, individuals of estimated African population affinity have a significantly higher estimated hazard of dying of plague compared to those with estimated white European population affinity. There are no significant associations with any of the other comparisons. When we pooled people with estimated white European and Asian population affinity using the pooled sex sample and the male-only sample, these analyses did not reveal evidence of significant difference in hazard rates between population affiliation groups. However, using the female-only sample, the results indicate that individuals with estimated African affiliations have a significantly higher estimated hazard of dying of plague compared to those with estimated white European Asian affiliation. These results suggest how intersectionality, compounded harm of race and gender, and misogynoir may have impacted mortality during medieval pandemic disease. These results suggest that, at least for females, individuals with estimated African affiliation faced higher hazards of dying of plague compared to individuals of estimated white European affiliations of similar age. The higher observed rates of LEH in individuals in the plague burials with estimated African 100% compared to those with white European Asian population affiliation 71% might be an artifact of small sample size. Alternatively, this might reflect differences in either exposure to stressors or survival of acute physiological stress during childhood, potentially reflecting enslavement and unfreedom. The data that we have analyzed here reveals that Black women, because of the structural harm of misogynoir, had a higher risk of pandemic SPP death. But what are the potential contexts of this higher risk? Along with anti-Blackness and misogyny, these women would have also had to deal with issues around class because they would have primarily been in the working class, particularly domestic labor. The use of a Black feminist methodologies has meant that we can now analyze this data specifically with a multi-issue lens. We point to Crenshaw's discussion of how intersectionality works in relationship to discrimination and compounded harm as a way to consider why Black women would have been at higher risk. Because of the white imaginary in relationship to the Black population's erasure in medieval England, there is little scholarship that discusses the contours of the labor of Black women. However, if we look at the scholarship in early modern England, the discussion is more robust and has pointed to Black women primarily being working class, especially in domestic labor. And David Sterling Brown. A Black woman's situation in domestic service also brings up the specter of labor theft, hard manual labor, as well as sexual harassment and coercion, if not assault, because of her status as a household servant. Clearly, medieval England and the embodied experience of London's racialized population, as attested in primary sources and based on preliminary data from a sample of 89 individuals from 2 cemeteries, who appear to make up about 20 to 30% of the population, are not directly comparable to modern populations. However, the study's results suggest that the health outcome of racism that we see today might have had parallels during the second pandemic. We recommend that intersectionality and critical race theories become integrated into medieval bioarchaeological studies, as well as the pandemic necropolitics seen in certain modern racialized communities. Although not without issue, we hope that geographically, temporally, and locally condition-specific MMS can make a contribution to reassessing the medieval archive of remains, documentary, and visual evidence. We believe Black feminist methodology is foundational to narrate the lived experience of Black people. The substantial pre-modern English community has been elided and erased. And so just to think about future work, I think a complete reassessment of the documentary evidence needs to happen. And for my own thinking, I'm thinking about Chaucer's Cook's Tale. I may start with an examination of the Cook's Guild documents in London, as well as in the records of English drama, as well as the bakers. I'm kind of curious to look at those too. I would also start examining the documentary evidence on these burial sites, which includes some wills. And I would also point to the possibilities of work from Susie Phillips, who's at Northeastern. She's given 2 talks about this. And this one is the one from Notre Dame. Her talk is about trading types, mercantile multilingualism, and race in the pre-modern virtual classroom. And she's about to publish a book about race and conduct literature, and particularly the Black serving class in early modern Europe. And I'm interested in thinking about how this might be. So, thank you. I think that would be
The floor to questions.
some of the data I can explain, some of that I cannot exactly.
Can I warm us up then with a very basic question? I mean, I think I get the general idea, but I just feel like it would be useful to have it. Can you just define, I'm not in this field, bioarchaeology and osteology for me?
Basically, if you think about it as an analysis of remains, right? And then they're doing I actually wrote in the cultural history of race in my chapter on race and religion, I kind of thinking through different methodologies that can help us think through stuff. And one of them was bioarchaeology. And I said, okay, if you think of a grave site as an archive of remains, that the remains may give you information about how people lived, right? One of the things I talked about in that and referencing other people's work in a kind of 13th century Islamic grave site was that your ribbon gives you like 7 years of data about what you died, right? That's really interesting to find out, right? Because then you're sort of like, okay, so what did you eat for the previous 7 years before you died? What does that mean in terms of like the environmental flora and fauna? Like, what are the like eating practices? I talked about the fact that there was like a higher rate of sugar consumption amongst girls versus boys in this particular gravesite and what that meant in relationship to Islamic holidays and basically Ramadan and stuff like that, and that sort of history of sugar. So basically, if you think about that, right, and what my colleagues, I would say Rebecca, like Becky, Joe, and Sharon have been doing in various ways, right? Sharon's done a lot of work with pandemic plague gravesites in England. So if you look at her her CV, you can see her talking about gender, about age, right? You can see her talking about, class, in terms of like the social class and what that meant in terms of who died and like what this looks like, right? And their argument in relationship, okay, so 60% of the population between 1348 and 1351 in London died because of the plague. Not everyone died who got in contact with the plague, right? Is their argument, even though the documentary evidence sort of is freaked out by the whole thing, not surprisingly. So their point is basically like, what you actually see is that, or what they're arguing is that if they had stressors previously in their life, particularly if it was happening in childhood, they had a higher, they were more likely to have died, right, from the disease, from a pandemic encounter. Which, if you think about it as the structures of class, race, gender, right, get into that mix. And then with that, also what happens with disability, right? You can kind of see how this scenario starts to happen.
Can I ask one tiny follow-up question, which is, so I totally get that if you've already got like the race part, but can you, from the osteological evidence or the bioarchaeological or the actual bodies is what I'm asking, are you deriving information about race or racedness from that?
So this is also in relationship to the ongoing like controversies happening in forensic archaeology.
Okay.
We actually redid all of our evidence analysis in relationship to like a bunch of stuff going on in there. And like, this is why we use the term population affinity. And then, we're very specific. We only use the 5 traits that are inheritable, that sort of change in time to discuss it. And this is why I also was super specific about framing it in relationship to time period and history and the conditions. So medieval England, how race is framed in medieval England, what are the factors involved there, how there are multiple racialized groups in medieval England, how through this, the fact that they are framing it in relationship to kind of a climatological geographic imagination. So even if you did not identify, if they thought that you were potentially, Black African, they would treat you as such. And so this would affect your life, right? So that's the way we kind of narrowed it down. So it's super, super specific to location, time period, and the very specific context in play. And then we're basically like, okay, so with that, what kind of data can we come up with? And I think this is the kind of interestingly and complicated part of it because, basically, I realized this last year when I had my first Zoom conversation with them. We'd been writing all this through email, right? So I've never met my other 3 collaborators in person. So this is the first time we were meeting in Zoom. And one of the things I asked them was the question of, so would it be possible? So what other, grave sites are in England that we might want to look at to see what the data is? What about Bristol, right? Bristol is a really big, booming, medieval maritime town. It also has a very early history of the transatlantic slave trade. So I was sort of asking, and then they were sort of like, well, what are you talking about? And I'm like, well, London makes sense. Like, and you guys ID'd these particular sites, but what other sites would we be able to find, multiracial data, right? And then they were like, oh, these are the only sites that have ever been analyzed in all of the sort of 500 to 1500 race sites, because no one's used this category of race in that analysis at all. This is it. So basically their point is, when I was like, what, why, what's going on? So all these years I've had various people tell me I can't say race when I talk about the Middle Ages because there's no empirical evidence, but apparently that empirical evidence is based on like actual no evidence, or basically the absence of evidence because we asked the actual category question, right? So that opens up a whole range of things. The thing that I think we were trying to distinguish in the article is that most of the other racialized groups in England, and specifically medieval England, say between 1100 and 1500, have specific other archives that discuss their presence, right, attached to them. But medieval Black England constantly is being told that it doesn't exist and that they have no archive. And my point is that, well, the archive is probably because I've skipped everything. And Chaucer's taught regularly everywhere. He is a canon author. He gets read everywhere. It's not an obscure text. And all of us were taught to ignore that detail, right? Just to like, I skip it, pretend it's like something else, right? Told that we couldn't read that way because there's no population data. But yes, there is, I mean, it's kind of interesting to follow all this because I was the one reading all the sort of bioarchaeology, archaeology stuff that had been coming up in the last year and showing up at various webinars, trying to understand what the hell is going on. But yeah, this is like and I think one of the things we say in it is like, you know, we think Black bioarchaeologists and bioanthropologists should be the ones to actually decide what the new methodologies are, and we will change the sort of data analysis and follow their lead. But this is what we can do now, if that makes sense. So we like dumped every category except for 5 that we all agreed is inheritable.
Laura Senior from Sociology and Anthropology. So I wanted to follow up on Laura. So did anybody actually do sequencing on any of the tissue, like genetic sequencing, or was this based on like you were
did, but I cannot explain that.
That's fine. Yes, no question is fine. So now an easier question towards the end of your talk, and I'm interested in where you think you're going to go next with, you know, the cook and the bakers, and I'm curious to know, like, what are you going to do in the classroom with students as you introduce these texts?
I've already done it. I give them the original Hefner and Redfern piece, and then I actually make them read D. Hartman's Venus in Two Acts. And then I give them the new data, and then I sort of explain it out, and then particularly the like everything we discuss. So any secondary material you read where they like basically say it's a white population, no, all right, is out. So, and I think it's been really interesting. I usually start at the very beginning to kind of completely reframe the whole class as a way to kind of go, okay, I mean, in some ways, I think it's exciting for them because I say, your thoughts on this are probably like groundbreaking and new because people just have not talked about this. So as you're reading secondary material, you will find out it's very different in opinion from what you were thinking about, right? So actually, it's really, it's been exciting in the classroom for them. And I think they are sort of, they are shocked about the methodological thing. I'm shocked, but I think this is the part where I would say actually collaborating with people completely in different fields. My colleagues just had the default assumption. And when we were in discussions, I was like, what is happening? I don't understand your methodology exactly. I do to a certain extent, but like, are you telling me they don't do this? And their discussion was basically like, they're not European. The European bioarchaeologists and bioanthropologists are not trained to do this. Becky's the only one in Europe who does it because she works with Joe, right? And the reason that it was developed in the first place was in relationship to North American archaeology, bioanthropology, forensic anthropology, anthropology, and that was because of NAGPRA, and then actually what happened at Howard and like the African burial ground in New York. So it's like a completely separate kind of North American history, right? Which the Europeans were like, well, we don't need this. We don't do race. Race doesn't exist in our world, blah, 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 that sort of thing. So, I mean, I would say on the, the interesting thing is thinking about why 500 to 1500. The classicists, the people who work on Rome and Britain, already said, oh yeah, Roman Britain 500 was multiracial. We know this, right? I mean, they get trolled by white supremacists about this, right? And then we know from the early modern period, and I sort of pointed and gave you guys a site for the burial ship of the Mary Rose. That is also being, worked on, but they've already talked about it as well. But for some reason, 500 and 1500, we just want to continue to pretend, right? And bury that and stuff like that.
I have a math.
Yes.
All right, so tell me if my math is correct. First of all, I understand the problem with methodology.
Yes.
And I also understand that there's a lot of archaeological work going on right now in London because of the plague and what they're discovering about what strain, etc. Okay, so let's say there's about 100,000 people in London by 1348.
80,000 apparently.
So 80,000, half of them die.
60%.
Okay, see, I already am probably math. Okay. 60% die.
Like 8% of them die.
So now you have 60,000 dead people.
8,000.
8,000 dead people.
48.
40,000.
48.
48.
All right, 48,000 dead people. So now and I understand the problems with methodology. So 48,000 dead people. You then do the archaeological excavations of X number of them.
Samples now.
Okay, so from your samples, they are extrapolating that
Gender,
18%
age,
of those live Londoners were of African descent.
like black or mixed black descent, yes.
Okay, so 18% of
Yeah.
80,000 based on archaeological samples. Okay.
The pre-pandemic percentages are around 8 or a little over 8. They, Becky and Joe, usually the population of Black London around 20 to 30%. And they discuss this in the article, but I don't talk about it because basically this is like really this is going to be underreported. If that makes sense. And then again, this is the only site that has ever been analyzed. We can't right? So, like the more data, the better, but this is like it at the moment. Talk about what's going on there. Does that explain the map?
Gordon Arabreno is from Sociology and Anthropology. My question is about various sites. So how is it that the sites might disappear or destroy as the cities are developing places? And so what it is that much of the evidence might have disappeared. And so what it means for preserving existing sites.
I don't know specifically about, I think this is a question probably for Karen, who she spent so much work doing medieval pandemic work on those sites. But it's basically, this was the initial site that they actually looked at was specifically just for pandemic dead, right? Because they knew the plague was coming and they tried to prepare. Otherwise, it was sort of like scattered over 100 parish church sites, right? So I think because of the connection to like a parish church, I would expect, I'm speculating, but it's harder to try to, that often does get preserved. That makes sense because it's usually often connected to like a parish that's still sort of working, functioning, living to the future. That makes sense. But yeah, they started there, but I think they could probably answer.
Because, you're saying underrepresented, and I think the part of underrepresented is not find the evidence because evidence got destroyed.
I'm sure that has happened as well, right? So yeah, but Joe and Becky are really clear that they think. And I think maybe the interesting percentage is the pre-pandemic, right? If they're seeing just 8, and this is just like a very small sampling, like it does show a kind of increase. So, right, and so like what that means. So yeah. Other questions? We have questions from.
Question. I was really, first of all, this is so interesting and eye-opening. Saying People had actually sent me some early material at one point about it, but this is great seeing it develop. And I had a question about the reading of the women, and I don't know if that included men as well as domestic laborers, and what the evidence for that is from. Is it also bioarchaeological, or is it like Habib has? I felt like Habib's reading, which is a little later, is a broader spectrum of professional interests and activities. And for the medieval period, it feels like it wouldn't look like this. It wouldn't look the same as the early modern period.
We talk a little bit in the article about the fact that we're thinking in these populations are really cities that have like very extensive trade networks. And then what you're seeing is a lot of movement in and out of particularly Southern Europe. And people are bringing their servants and, again, enslaved or formerly enslaved to these cities and settling. And then the bioarchaeological data seems to also for this, right, that they lived working class, probably domestic labor lives. And this explains also various kinds of hazards that are evident in their remains. And so that sort of like a both, right? That we have to, we're speculating off of the early modern scene into the medieval scene, but why would it be that different necessarily, especially in urban centers, particularly as we know lots of people, there's a sort of movement heading into the cities because of basically merchant networks, right? So this is what we're really about. And so I think the domestic makes sense in all these sorts of ways. I think the Chaucer is a clue, right? He's basically a domestic laborer. He is a cook, right? He would have been part of a guild, but he's basically a servant. And he's not enslaved in the text, but this may open up all these other questions. I hope that makes sense. It's basically it's a sort of it's like a both, right? There is some discussion, but no one really then talks about what that means about migration, particularly from the Mediterranean into England because of mercantile and trade networks, right? And then who brought their servants with them, or those that they had enslaved with them, right, to England, and then what happened after that, right? So it's kind of one of those things. And then I would say the bioarchaeological evidence suggests yes, it's us,
But not necessarily. Like I guess I feel like the early modern is like mixed in terms of that status is
Yes.
complicated, right? Because there's indentured servants and
So the unfreedoms question, and I think the thing is, like, we do know of examples of, there's that 13th century, basically, document that talks about an Islamic enslaved man running away, right? And then, the person who had enslaved him trying to find him, right? There's little snatches of things, but I think one of the things, and I don't get it into here as much, but I actually speculate more in another article. I wrote an article called Intersectionality for the Routledge Companion to Intersectionalities for Jennifer Nash and Samantha Pinto. And it was basically, I wrote a lot about, what does all this mean, and the bioarchaeology article that we can only have 10,000 words with like footnotes and bibliography, which is so some of it ended up in the other article where I basically talk about, well, what does this mean, right? It may mean that, you know, the sort of genealogy of the transatlantic slave trade in relationship to England started to happen earlier, which kind of makes sense if you think about what several of the early modern colleagues, sort of Jennifer Morgan and others, have talked about, that England was really good at, you know, adopting and then deploying transatlantic slavery very quickly. And I would argue that means that they had a rehearsal, they had practice, they had been, you know, we agree with Geraldine Hang that they're one of the first sort of areas that creates a racial state in the 12th and 13th century in relationship to its Jewish population. They had practice. And then if you then fold in, like, you know, the question of unfreedom and, you know, anti-Blackness is already sort of being rehearsed there in various ways. Then the adoption of what happens in the early modern period, the fast, very quick, very sort of, you know, efficient adoption of all this makes more sense, I would say. I also say in the other piece that, you know, it also means we have to think about an earlier timeline of racial capitalism and what that means. Like, if you think about that as sort of early, or a certain branch of it being looted, what does that mean, right? As well, like, this is sort of also something that they're out, things like that. Their fast adoption is not fast, just much more.
I want to thank Dr. Kim for being with us. Please join us on Monday, October 23rd for our next Faculty Works in Progress presentation by Sylvia Prina, Associate Professor of Economics. Her talk will be entitled Public Opinion, Racial Bias in the U.S. Labor Market. Thank you so much. Thanks to Tanya and to Abhishek for all of their support. Get us going on our series.